Okay, so we're going to be talking about Hugo Vlad again. This should be the final updated version of his kit. So let's talk about how to play him and if he's even going to be any good. For this video, I'm going to be skipping over any of the abilities that don't really matter since I've already addressed them in my first impressions video. And we're just going to really get into the main portions of his kit. Now, what his EX special Soul Hunter punishment does is it puts Vlad behind the enemy and then he will do a spin attack with his scythe followed up by a bigger crystal slash. Interestingly enough, this EX special isn't considered as a heavy attack like most EX specials in the game, meaning that if you use it during the rainbow stun bar on an enemy, it won't actually trigger a chain attack. I'm not really sure why it works like that. Maybe there's some hidden tech I'm not noticing, but we'll see in the future. As for the motion value for this EX special, it's pretty low at 747%. For comparison's sake, this is lower than Ellen's, which doesn't really do a lot of damage either. This is pretty weird because DPSs typically only have this low of a scaling on their EX special if it has a second version which costs more energy. But nope, there's no second skill. The scaling on this is just that low. Moving on to his dodge counter, Phantasm Slash. It actually has a surprisingly good motion value for a dodge counter because not only does it have a good base scaling at 492%, which is the second highest scaling for a dodge counter, only lower than Silver Soldier Ambi's, but this can also be followed up by a charge shot from his suitcase, which is considered as basic attack damage and has an additional scaling of 424%, totaling to 916 motion value, which is actually pretty damn good for a dodge counter that you can do frequently if the enemy is attacking you. Sadly, the rest of his kit focuses him more into an off-field bursty playstyle, so you won't be able to use this dodge counter as much as you'd want. But if you have downtime in your team where your stunner doesn't have energy and doesn't really do much without it, for example Lighter without his morale or enough energy to EX special, you could instead on-field Vlad for a little bit to get some of these dodge counters off, and it would give you some additional damage. This really only applies to that niche scenario though, since as you'll see later on, Vlad prefers to play in double stun teams, which give him practically zero field time, except for when an enemy is stunned, and when an enemy is stunned they can't hit you, meaning you can't do this dodge counter, making it practically useless in those teams. But yeah, the dodge counter isn't terrible depending on the way you want to play him and who you're playing him with. For the most part, it doesn't really have that high of a priority compared to his other abilities, just because of the way his kit is more focused into not being on field. What his core passive Terminating Verdict does is after using his chain attack or stunning an enemy with Vlad specifically, his crit rate will increase by 12% and his crit damage will also increase by 25%, lasting for 6 seconds, with repeated triggers of this ability resetting the duration. This is pretty nice because more crit rate and crit damage is just always good, so it's nice that he gets a total of 49 CV for free, helping him do even more damage. Additionally, when hitting a stunned enemy with Vlad's EX special or ultimate, it will trigger the Totalize effect, which looks pretty similar to your anomaly or disorder procs where it pops up that text on screen. And what triggering this effect does is it will increase the multiplier of the ability that triggered Totalize based on how long the enemy was stunned for, while also instantly ending the enemy's stun state after this effect is triggered. After the enemy is unstunned from the Totalize effect, days will instantly be accumulated onto the enemy based on the amount of stun time remaining when Totalize was triggered, with a conversion rate of 5% days per second of stun remaining, capping out at 25% days, aka 5 seconds of stun remaining, which is pretty easy to cap for the majority of enemies in the game. This days accumulation is also based off the enemy's maximum days, so it is just filling up at most 25% of the days bar regardless of the enemy stats, which is really nice because it helps you get enemies stunned more frequently, because in order to trigger Totalize, again the enemy has to be stunned, so this helping you stun enemies more often is just really nice. And then the final cherry on top for this core passive is Vlad also gains 300 or 900 attack if there are 1 or 2 stun characters in the team. So if you have 2 stun characters, you get 900 extra attack, which is really good, and it lets him play in double stun teams without being punished as much for not using a character like Astra, which gives 1200 attack. Obviously 900 attack isn't as good as 1200 attack, but stunners give buffs as well, so them giving their buffs while also helping you stun more while also giving Vlad 900 attack is really nice, and it makes double stun teams a very viable option for Vlad specifically. So I just did a whole bunch of yapping about Totalize and it probably sounds really complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. To dumb it down, again, all you have to do is use your EX special or ultimate when an enemy is stunned and you will trigger this effect. Triggering Totalize will give you a multiplier increase for the ability that triggered this effect, causing that ability to deal a very large amount of damage. However, both your ultimate and your EX special cannot get the multiplier increase since it only gives it to that first ability that triggers Totalize and the second ability won't trigger it. For example, if you ult on Vlad after stunning an enemy, the ultimate will get the Totalize effect, meaning the ultimate will not only get the multiplier increase from Totalize, but it will also end the enemy's stun, and then your EX special afterwards will not trigger Totalize because the enemy is no longer stunned, and it will not get any multiplier increase either. And then it's vice versa if you use your EX special first and then your ultimate afterwards. So how much multiplier increase does Totalize actually give? Well, it firstly gives a 1000% increase and then a 280% increase for each remaining second of stun on the enemy that is less than or equal to 5 seconds, totaling to a 1400% increase as long as the enemy is stunned for 5 seconds. You will get this 1400% increase against almost every enemy except super squishy normal enemies that you wouldn't need the maximum increase to kill anyways. And then you get a further 100% increase increase for each remaining second of stun in between 5 and 15 seconds, totaling to a 1000% increase against an enemy that is stunned for 15 seconds. So the maximum multiplier increase you can get from this Totalize effect is 3400%. Sounds like a lot and is a lot. However, no enemy currently has a base stun duration of 15 seconds. The highest an enemy can have is 13 seconds. However, Lighter's stun duration increase does actually synergize with Vlad's core passive, meaning that you can get this full multiplier increase against enemies that start with at least a 12-second base stun duration. However, because Vlad's optimal rotations do have him use 2 chain attacks, this means that you will lose out on the additional 3 seconds that Lighter gives. So in those cases, you won't be able to typically get this maximum increase, and you'd instead be getting an increase of 3200% against an enemy with 13-second stun duration. This is still good, but it's unfortunate that you're missing out on that bit of extra damage. However, this is not the only problem with the way this multiplier increase functions, because just like any other character, Vlad's abilities have animations and none of them pause the game besides his ultimate's cutscene. An enemy's stun duration will be going down while you're doing your Vlad's abilities, such as your chain attack or the hit after your ultimate's cutscene. Like I mentioned earlier, this will also affect Lighter's stun duration increase / pause, since yes, he does increase the stun duration by 3 seconds, but the animation length of both your chain attacks and your ultimate, if you use it, will use up about 3 seconds of time, making it as if his stun duration increase never even happened. However, this is where Lighter's stun duration increase becomes more important, because while he may not be letting Vlad get the full multiplier increase from a 15-second stun duration enemy, he is still preventing you from losing more stun duration than you would have without him. For example, if an enemy has a base 13-second stun duration, Lighter will make you go to 15 seconds, and then you will fall back down to 13 seconds after using your Vlad's animations before triggering Totalize. However, if you did not have Lighter on your team, that enemy would start at 13 seconds, and then they would fall down to around 10 seconds, which makes you lose out on damage that you wouldn't have if Lighter was on the team. This is extremely important, and in teams without Lighter, losing out on these extra seconds of stun duration can matter a lot because it's making your Totalize damage lower. And this is even more noticeable if you try to do double chain attacks on Vlad, since you're adding another chain attack animation before you can even trigger Totalize. And you could just not do double chain attacks on Vlad, but his chain attacks have a pretty good motion value of 1402%, so not being able to do 2 of them is pretty impactful since they do pretty good damage. On top of this, I haven't even mentioned the fact that a lot of enemies don't even have a stun duration of 13 seconds. Most elites and bosses have a 12-second or 10-second stun duration, and some even have a 7-second stun duration, which will decrease his damage from Totalize even further, and it'll make the impact of having Lighter to pause the stun timer even more significant. All in all, this makes him a lot more situational than other characters, because he not only wants to worry about matching the enemy's weakness, but he also has to worry about if the enemy even has a high stun duration in the first place, or else you'll lose out on a lot of damage. For example, if you want to play him against any of the ionized shadow enemies like Jane, Pulchra, Moors, or even Vlad himself, you're gonna have a pretty damn hard time because all of those enemies have a 7-second stun duration. So if you don't have Lighter, you're gonna lose out on almost all of the multiplier increase from Totalize, because the enemy is gonna have like 5 seconds left of stun duration when you actually trigger it. So that's a pretty important factor to consider when looking at how this Totalize effect works. Now, I've only mostly talked about the negatives of this effect, but again, assuming you are fighting an enemy with a higher stun duration, the increase you're getting is actually pretty good. His ultimate has a base scaling of 3055%, and when you add the multiplier increase from a more generic 12-second stun duration enemy, you get a total motion value of 6155%, which is actually really high, and is a larger scaling than even Miyabi's ultimate or level 3 charge. So his ultimate will do very good damage if you're fighting an enemy that has a longer stun duration and is a better matchup for Vlad specifically. Does this mean he will out damage Miyabi because his ultimate has a higher scaling? Fuck no, because Miyabi doesn't have all the restrictions that Vlad does, and she can also use her level 3 charges a lot more often, while Vlad's largest scaling is locked behind his ultimate, which you just won't have every rotation because he's an off-field character that generates less decibels. You have to remember, you only get this Totalize multiplier increase on either his EX special or his ultimate, not both of them. So after you use his ult, his EX special will have a really low scaling of 747% and will just not do nearly as much damage as his ultimate. And because most of his teams focus him into being a more off-field character, since he is usually played with a character like Lycaon that wants to be on-field to trigger as much days buildup as possible. This makes Vlad's decibel generation a lot lower because he is just on-field for a shorter amount of time, meaning he won't have his ultimate every time an enemy is stunned. So let's say, for example, you're on your second rotation, Vlad used his ultimate in the previous one, and now you have to trigger Totalize with his EX special, assuming the same 12-second stun duration enemy. This EX special will have a motion value of 3940 47% after the increase, which is just a lot lower than the 6,155% motion value you'd have on your ultimate if it was triggering Totalize. So pretty much it's one big hit from Vlad versus Miyabi's multiple more frequent big hits that also have the benefit of having very large AoE. So I think it's pretty easy to tell which of these is better. Does this mean that Vlad's damage is terrible though? Also no, which I'll get more into in the later sections of this video. Now what his additional ability Prelude to Finality does is when there's a same faction or stun character in the team, you'll trigger this no matter what. Every Vlad team will have a stunner. If you don't have a stunner with Vlad, you're really grieving. Don't run that team. Please run Vlad with a stunner so you don't have to worry about not being able to fulfill this restriction. Now what this additional ability does is Vlad's chain attack gets a 15% damage increase with a further increase of 35% against normal enemies, which helps him clear squishy mobs easier. And the ability that triggers Totalize, aka his EX special or his ultimate, will gain a 40% damage increase as well, on top of his EX special generating an additional 20 energy when it's the ability that actually triggers Totalize with a 30-second cooldown. So pretty much his chain attack gets 15% damage bonus against bosses, 35% against squishy enemies, and your EX special or ultimate against the stunned enemy gains a 40% damage increase if it triggers Totalize. 40% damage bonus is really good and it affects the ability that does the most damage, so really good additional ability. You'll get this on pretty much any team unless it's a dog shit team, so yeah, nice. So that's pretty much his entire kit and all of his abilities that actually matter. Now, how does he actually function as a character? His gameplay loop will pretty much be spending most of the field time on your stunner to get the enemy stunned as fast as possible, letting you trigger Totalize from your EX special or your ultimate as often as you can, since it's where the largest portion of his damage comes from. After triggering Totalize on a stunned enemy by either using your ultimate or your EX special, depending on what you have, you then swap off to your stunner and then you repeat the process. It's pretty damn simple. TLDR, use your stunner, stun the enemy, use your Vlad's ultimate or EX special, then repeat the process. However, if you're playing a team with only one stunner and that stunner is a character like Lighter that has some downtime, you can then swap into Vlad during that downtime and do his dodge counters or charge shots preferably to get some extra damage. I'd recommend a team like this less than a double stun team because again his core passive gives 900 attack from running 2 stunners, which lets his damage come a lot closer to a team with 1 stunner plus Astra, while this double stunner team just lets him stun quicker, which means he'll just overall have faster rotations, which can make this team a lot closer if not better than the Astra teams. But yeah, pretty much just think of his playstyle as Haramasa if he didn't have to do his 90 complicated combos and instead he just pressed skill and ult when an enemy is stunned and called it a day. Now what his signature W-Engine does is it has a 24% crit rate main stat, and what the passive does is it gives 45% crit damage, and when using an EX special, chain attack, or ultimate to deal ice damage specifically, the equipper will gain the absolute zero death stance effect. I know that name sounds cringy as fuck, lasting for 3 seconds, and while this effect is active, the user will ignore 25% of the enemy's defense when landing a hit. This engine is very good, what a surprise, and it will be Vlad's best in slot option as it just gives him a large amount of stats. 93 crit value plus 25% def ignore is really good. However, this def ignore can only be activated by dealing ice damage, making it slightly less universal, but it's still a very good stat stick because the crit damage and crit rate is just applied no matter what. You're still getting 93 crit value for free, which is actually really good. As for his alternative W engines, pretty much any limited 5-star stat stick that gives crit will be very good. For example, Juyan, Haramasa, and Evelyn's signature are all very good stat stick options as they just give you a lot of crit. And then Ambi and Ellen's signatures are also good options as well, but you have to slightly play around them by adding a dash attack or a basic attack to fully trigger their requirements, which can make them a bit more uncomfortable to use compared to the previously mentioned W engines. Sadly, Brimstone isn't a very good option as Vlad doesn't want to do any of the trigger conditions for this engine, so he won't be able to stack it up very well at all. And if this is the only W engine you have, I'd honestly just recommend going for his signature. As for the 4-star options, Marcato Desire is a good free-to-play option, and if you don't have this engine, you can use Street Star, but at this point the damage drop-off from Street Star to any of the 5-star W engines will be pretty damn high, so I just consider getting his signature engine if you don't have any of these limited 5-star stat sticks. Now moving on to his Drive This options, he actually has quite a bit of different options he can use, with the main 3-4 pieces being Hormone Punk, Puffer Electro, and Woodpecker, and out of these 3 options, as you can see, Hormone Punk is just the best one, while Woodpecker is slightly worse, and Puffer Electro is just the worst out of the 3 options. In Hormone Punk's case, you actually for the most part won't have full uptime of Hormone Punk if you're running a double stun team. This is just because since you're running 2 stunners, this means that an enemy will likely get stunned quicker than the 20-second cooldown on Hormone Punk, meaning that when you trigger Hormone Punk on the first rotation, by the time you get to your second rotation, less than 20 seconds would have passed by then, so you just won't have the 4-piece active for that second rotation. But even regardless of this downtime, it still gives a better performance than the other 2 options rotations, just because the damage you're gaining for the rotations where you do actually have Hormone Punk active is just that big compared to the other two options. And this is mostly because the other two sets also have their uptime problems as well. For Puffer Electro, you need your ultimate to trigger the 4-piece, and you don't have your ultimate every rotation either. And for Woodpecker, you need to do basics, dodge counters, EX specials, which he won't fully have all three done during his biggest damage abilities like his chain attack or his ultimate. You of course can do a basic before your ultimate, but you can't do an EX special before his ultimate, which would just make the damage you gain from Woodpecker not as much as Hormone Punk, regardless of the uptime issues on Hormone Punk. I do want to point out though that the difference between all three of them really isn't that big. The difference between Woodpecker and Hormone is only roughly 1.2%. So while I recommend Hormone more because it just gives more damage, it really doesn't matter, and I would just use whatever has better substats. And then if you're either playing a single stun team or if you're playing a double stun team with two stunners that don't take a lot of field time, you can then, like I said earlier, give Vlad the field time instead. But in that case, you wouldn't want to use Hormone Punk because, well, you're swapping in more often, and it makes it a lot harder to get Hormone Punk to be active when an enemy is stunned. So in cases like that, running different sets would just be better. Funnily enough though, honestly, all of these sets aren't really even that great on Vlad. They all have some form of uptime issues, and none of them really perfectly synergize with him. And because of the fact that none of these sets have perfect synergy with him, you could even opt for triple 2-piece and just say fuck the 4-piece, because for the most case, they're really not doing that much more than just running triple 2-piece with really cracked substats. And it's actually what I'm going to be doing for my Vlad build, because I just don't have the perfect 4-piece on Hormone Punk. But yeah, for the most part, just use whatever combination you want, whether it's Puffer Electro, Hormone Punk, or Woodpecker, or even triple 2-piece. Just go off whatever has the best substats, I'm not gonna lie, and hopefully he gets a better, more synergistic set in the future that you can spend all of your stamina on then. As for the main stats, you run on your slot 4, 5, and 6. If you're on his signature or a crit rate W-Engine, I'd recommend running a crit damage slot 4 and just getting a lot of crit from your substats. But if you can't reach 90% or higher crit rate with a crit damage slot 4, just run a crit rate 1. Because his damage is mainly focused in that one single hit that triggers Totalize, you really want to make sure this single hit crits, so getting as much crit rate as possible is very important. But it is very possible to achieve 100% crit rate even with a crit damage slot 4 as long as your engine has crit rate. So pretty much just go off whatever your stats require. As for your slot 5, ice damage bonus is roughly 2% better than pen ratio, but again, that's not a very big difference. So if you have a good pen ratio slot 5, you can just opt for that one instead. And then your slot 6 is going to be attack percent. That's pretty much a no-brainer. There's not really anything else you can run on Vlad that really matters. Also forgot to mention this earlier, if you're not running triple 2-piece and you are running a 4-piece, I'd recommend running 2-piece Woodpecker, as crit rate is really nice and you want to make sure you get to as much as you can. But if you have 100% crit rate somehow without factoring in a 2-piece, you can then run a 2-piece like Branch, Hormone Punk, or Polar Metal that just give you more damage. Okay, time to talk about his team options. To no one's surprise, I've mentioned this guy like 50 fucking times already in this video. Lighter will be his best in slot teammate. Lighter is just the best buffer for fire/ice DPSs, and Vlad is an ice DPS, so they'll just work together very well. However, unlike the other existing ice and fire DPSs that synergize with Lighter, Vlad has an even higher dependence on him, as Lighter is the only character that can currently affect the enemy's stun duration, allowing Vlad to get more damage from his Totalize effect. If in the future we get more stunners that interact with the stun duration on an enemy, maybe Vlad will have more options in this regard, but currently Lighter just does too much for Vlad, making him a highly recommended option. And honestly, I wouldn't really recommend playing Vlad teams without Lighter because he's just that fucking good. If we instead use Trigger over Lighter, Vlad's personal damage ends up being roughly 23% worse, and he goes from doing roughly 8 million damage every 2 rotations to now doing 6 million damage every 2 rotations, which bumps him down a lot more, and he's now more comparable to Julian. But in scenarios where the enemy does not have a 12-second stun duration, he will get punished even more, and then in that case, Julian will just be better. Pretty much, if you don't have Lighter, he will perform a pretty noticeable amount worse, and he will go from a character that I think is arguably top 5 DPS to a character that's only really better than the character that released on launch, aka Ellen, and that's honestly kind of embarrassing. Moving on to another character that synergizes with Vlad very well. I've actually also talked about him for a bit in this video as well, but it'd be the furry goat himself, Lycaon.
Lycaon, raise your children. Yeah, Dad, I miss you. Yeah, Dad, let's do something together.
Lycaon, I'm gay, let's fight! Yes, you go.
Lycaon is actually a very good option as well, because again, Vlad benefits a lot from having 2 stunners. Lycaon can be that second stunner paired with Lighter, which gives you a pretty damn synergistic team. Lycaon's more suited as an on-field stunner, while Lighter is more suited to be an off-field bursty stunner, so they both kind of fill each other's downtime, and it will just work really well. If you don't have or simply don't want to use Lycaon, Trigger is a very comparable option to him. It ends up being better than him if you have her W-Engine because of its stacking the defense defense down with Vlad's signature engine as well. But because of the fact that not everyone has Trigger's W-Engine and they're pretty comparable without that, I would just recommend Lycaon more so because he's a free unit and Trigger is a more versatile unit, so you will likely want her on your second team. So I'd rather use her in that other team instead of trying to force her with Vlad if you already have Lycaon. If you don't want to run a double stun team, Astra will be your best supportive option, but like I said earlier, I recommend this team a bit less overall than the double stun teams. And more importantly, playing a double stun team just frees up your Astra for your other teams, which matters a lot because Astra is good in pretty much every team in the game, so a character not needing her in their team is just really fucking good, and it's a massive benefit for your account's team building options. Qingyi is another good stun option, and she actually ends up being the best third option in this team, better than Lycaon and Trigger, as her stun damage multiplier buff is just very good, and it's just better than Lycaon's res shred and 35% stun damage multiplier. However, despite Qingyi theoretically giving more damage to Vlad, there is actually a potential downside to using her in this team. She actually can have anti-synergy in these teams with Vlad from simply being too good at stunning, making her miss out on subjugation stacks, so her buffs end up just being worse than the other stun options. This is because not only are you likely running a double stun team, which just makes your stunning quicker in general, but Vlad also deals 25% of the enemy's maximum days on his own, so both these factors combined together can make the enemies get stunned too fast, preventing Qingyi from being able to do as much as she could. Now this varies in a lot of cases. In Deadly Assault this shouldn't be a problem because the enemies just take longer to stun, and it also depends on the Shiyu defense lineup as well because some of those enemies also take longer to stun as well. So in cases where your Qingyi fully gets her subjugation stacks, she actually will perform very well, but this potential problem is something that is important to bring up. Whether this problem actually occurs often enough to make Qingyi feel noticeably worse, we'll have to see. And again, Qingyi is not a free character, Lycaon is, and he doesn't have this issue of not gaining his full buff from stunning too fast like Qingyi does. So whether you should use one or the other is mostly up to the content that you are up against and if you need Qingyi on that second team. Nicole is also very good as just a raw buffer similar to Astra, and could potentially even give a larger damage increase than Astra because of how well her defense down will stack with Vlad's. But again, I recommend running double stun more than these teams. If you don't have any of the other mentioned characters, you can run Pulchra, but I'd only ever use her as the third option in a double stun team, and even then she's not really that good unless you have her M6, as Vlad doesn't do any aftershock damage, meaning that pre M6 she's just not giving any buffs and all she's doing is contributing to stun, and at that point I would rather just use Nicole, who's a completely free character. And then you could just use characters like Lucy or Caesar that are your generic buffers that work in every team. They won't really be that great, but you can use them. I think at that point your team is pretty cope, but hey, it is what it is. You gotta do what you gotta do. And then the final team option that I've been kind of hiding till now, but if you pay attention to any of my community posts on YouTube, you probably already know who this is. It'll be the newest stun character releasing after Vlad, aka Jufufu. Now as for what Jufufu does, I'll give you a quick rundown. She is pretty much a off-field aftershock attacking stunner, very similarly to Trigger, and what she buffs is she gives a fuck ton of crit damage while also giving chain attack and ultimate damage bonus, on top of increasing the maximum decibel limit from 3000 to 4000 and giving an additional 500 decibels when you ult on your characters. Now this is very good for Vlad as he cares about using his ultimate and he likes crit damage, and that extra decibel generation also helps him greatly as well. As for how good she actually is in his teams is a bit more complicated. Now when I first heard that Jufufu could make you ult more often, I assumed, well, what if she could make Vlad ult every rotation? His ultimate is his highest form of damage, and if you could actually ult every rotation, it would be a pretty good increase to Vlad's personal damage. Sadly though, from the leaked gameplay I've seen of teams with Jufufu and Vlad, I have not seen him ever able to use his ultimate once every rotation, making her impact on his teams not as big as I'd hope it'd be. As you can see from the calcs I've done, Vlad's personal damage ends up being 10% worse in teams with Jufufu over Lycaon, as she's not able to let you ult every rotation, and if she's not able to do that, her crit damage and ultimate damage bonus buffs are just not better than Lighter's res shred and stun damage multiplier. From what I've seen, Jufufu does seem to deal a good amount more personal damage than Lycaon specifically, so the difference between a Lycaon team and a Jufufu team won't be exactly 10% since she is also contributing to team DPS. So while Lycaon still has the edge over Jufufu since his buffs are just better, the gap won't be as big as you may think. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about Trigger, where if Lycaon is about the same or even slightly better, there's not really much reason to try to force Trigger into this team or even pull her if you can just make Lycaon, who's a free unit, work very well in this team. So that pretty much applies to Jufufu as well in the case where she cannot let Vlad ult every rotation. However, what if we looked at how much damage Vlad personally does if he is actually able to ult every rotation with Jufufu's buffs? The current gameplay I've seen of Jufufu and Vlad together has had Vlad on Hormone Punk with very little field time, which makes the chance of him being able to ult every rotation a lot lower than it may actually be if you opted for a more on-field playstyle playstyle with Vlad instead, so he could generate more decibels. Of course, if you swap to a more on-field playstyle, you would have to then lose Hormone Punk because you cannot proc it as reliably anymore. But like I said earlier in the video, the difference between Hormone Punk and Woodpecker or Puffer Electro or even triple two-piece is very small, and I could even see Puffer Electro becoming his new best set, because if Jufufu is able to let you ult every rotation, Puffer Electro will now buff you every rotation as well. So if Jufufu does actually allow Vlad to ult every rotation, she'll end up making Vlad's personal damage roughly 10% better than in teams with Lycaon instead. And if you opt for Puffer Electro as your 4-piece instead of Hormone Punk, since in this team it is now more synergistic, Jufufu will be a roughly 15% increase over Lycaon in this team, and Puffer Electro ends up being roughly 4% better than Hormone Punk. While Puffer Electro only looks to be 4% better than Hormone Punk for in-stun damage, because of the fact that you can't control when Hormone Punk triggers, it's just whenever you swap in, and this team wants Vlad to swap in more frequently, you can't guarantee that your Hormone Punk will actually be active when an enemy is stunned, making the damage difference from Hormone Punk and Puffer Electro even bigger than this 4% that I calc, because Hormone Punk just becomes less reliable. All in all, assuming that she does allow Vlad to ult every rotation, this would just make her the undisputed best third slot in his team. But because there's so little gameplay of this team specifically, making it uncertain if Vlad can actually ult every rotation with Jufufu, and Jufufu's kit has been changing very frequently throughout the beta, my verdict on her for Vlad team specifically is pretty up in the air right now, and we'll have to see how she functions with him when we get more gameplay or when she's fully released. So to pretty much sum up this entire team building section, as long as you have Lighter, his third slot is very flexible. You can run a lot of different stunners here, with Jufufu potentially being the best option, assuming the best case scenario. But if that scenario is not achievable, then this third slot option will be relatively similar for all the limited 5-star stunners, with Lycaon being the most recommended simply because he is a free character. So I've yapped about his kit, I've yapped about how to play him, I've yapped about who he's good with and what drive this to run. I've yapped about pretty much everything there is to yap about for this character, but I haven't yapped about how good he actually is. While as a nice DPS, most people will instantly compare him to Miyabi and wonder if he can match her damage output similarly to a well-played Evelynn or Ambi. Sorry to ruin your hopes and dreams, but no, he is not on any of their levels. His damage output is more comparable to a well-played Haramasa, with him having the upside of shorter and easier rotations, allowing for more damage for the average player. This is optimal Haramasa I'm comparing him to, not the average Haramasa that only does like 6 dashes and misses out on a lot of fucking damage. If you're one of the people that play Haramasa and cannot make full use of his kit, Vlad will be an even bigger increase compared to Haramasa. So this comparison can vary depending on level of skill, so take that into mind. I'd say this is Vlad's biggest upside. The fact that he is so simple to play will make the majority of players able to reach his full damage potential as long as they have proper investment. On top of this, because his core passive automatically builds daze onto the enemies and he is usually running a double stun team, his rotations will just be on average faster than a character like Haramasa, who only uses Qingyi as his sole stunner and he doesn't build up a significant amount of daze on his own like Vlad does. This makes him a good DPS, but not better than some of the already existing options that are at the top of the meta like Miyabi, Evelynn, and Ambi. However, in terms of meta, there's not really that much of a reason to pull him because he is just worse than those other mentioned characters, and on top of this, he has his own issues that I mentioned earlier with his Totalize effect and how he can be heavily impacted depending on the enemy matchup. Additionally, he also doesn't really seem like that much of a future-proof character. Yes, we're getting Jufufu, who may be better than Lighter, keyword may. She might actually end up being worse depending on how her final kit ends up turning out, but power creep is a very relevant thing in these gacha games. We're very likely going to get even stronger DPSs in the next upcoming patches, and even with Jufufu on Vlad's teams in the optimal scenario where she does let him ult every rotation, he's still worse than the current best existing DPSs, who are likely going to get power crept as well. Of course, you can say this for every character. Why pull Miyabi? Just save for Yu Xuan, she might end up power creeping her, but I think it's a bit more relevant when you're talking about a character who isn't even currently the best character, and he likely has a chance of getting heavily restricted in future Shiyu lineups where enemies just either don't have a nice weakness or just have really short stun durations, and I can see him ending up in a situation very similar to Jane. Right now, Jane has pretty good damage, but there's rarely ever physical weak enemies in Shiyu, and I don't think I've ever seen a physical weak enemy in Deadly Assault either. So despite Jane's damage being pretty good, she's not really used that much because there's not much situations that warrant using her over other characters. Again, Vlad is not bad. He still has his upsides, like not needing Astra or Nicole, so they're available on other teams, on top of his ease and comfort to play compared to a similar DPS like Haramasa, but overall his potential downsides, combined with him not having quite enough damage compared to the more recent characters, makes him a harder to recommend pull if what you're looking for is a very good DPS that has a larger amount of content that they are good in, while also being less likely to fall out of meta relevancy compared to other characters. Did I pretty much just describe Miyabi? Maybe, but hey, she's the fucking GOAT. What do you want, man? Of course, if you really like him, you think he's really cool, and you really want to play him, don't feel like you can't pull him. I say this in all my videos, but at the end of the day, you should do what makes you have the most fun, and Vlad will be able to clear content. If I can still clear content with Ellen, you can be damn sure you can clear content with Vlad. So if that's enough for you, go ahead and pull him. But with 2.0 around the corner, we're bound to get even more characters that either raise the damage ceiling higher or are just closer to that ceiling than Vlad is, which is an important aspect to consider when pulling a character. But yeah, that pretty much sums up my thoughts. I think Vlad's a pretty cool character, and his core passive is a pretty creative mechanic, and I hope they come up with more unique mechanics like that in the future. While he isn't the strongest DPS and is more on the balanced end, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as not every DPS needs to be Miyabi levels of broken. I do wish he was a tiny bit stronger, but hey, it is what it is. You can't always get what you want in life. At least he's still a good enough DPS that doesn't need Astra in his best teams, while also being able to make use of older units like Lycaon, which can go a long way for some accounts. Being able to use a more niche character like Lycaon and not having to use a very popular unit like Astra is goated for just giving you more options overall, which is really nice for accounts that either don't have her or just want more options in general. So yeah, that's a pretty big W. So that'll pretty much be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I honestly didn't expect for this video to be so goddamn long, but here we are. That'll pretty much be it. Hope y'all have a great day, and I'll see y'all on the next one.